Welcome to the Greg Koford Books Authorcast. My name is Brian Whitney. I am an editor and I handle the marketing for Greg Koford Books. And for those of you who have been listeners to the Greg Koford Books Authorcast, we're going to try something a little bit different this time and see how it works. We're going to do this as a videotaping session and put this up on YouTube. So those of you who subscribe to the podcast will still get this as a complete audio in your podcast feed. But for those of you who would prefer to watch this on video, we'll give a YouTube link and people can head on over there and watch the video of it. So let me introduce today's guest. We're excited to have Melvin C. Johnson with us today. Just let me give a little brief background for Melvin. He's an independent historian and retired college professor, a writer and a speaker who pursues subjects dealing with the East Texas and Milltown culture, the Texas Hill Country before the Civil War, and the intersection of Western America and Mormonism. His work won the Smith-Pettit Best Book Award in 2007 for Polygamy on the Pedernales, Lyman Wight's Mormon Village in Antebellum, Texas, and also the Greg Koford Best Theological article in 2017 for John Hawley, Mormon Ulysses, his LDS mission to Iowa, and eventual RLDS conversion. And that was published in the John Whitmer Historical Association Journal. He and his wife, Hawley, live in Salt Lake City, as well as Tyler, Texas. So today, we're going to be discussing Melvin's newest book, titled Life and Times of John Pierce Hawley, a Mormon Ulysses in the American West. Melvin, thanks for joining us.
I'm glad to be here, Brian.
The trip up from Texas was good, I hear?
Well, a 2-hour delay while they looked for a hamster for the flywheel, but we got in okay.
Great to have you. So before we get into the book, let's talk a little bit about your background and your interest in Mormon and Western history. How did all of this start academically, writing-wise?
Academically and writing-wise, it began, I guess, at Dixie Junior College a long time ago. I actually met Juanita Brooks. I had no idea who she was, and all I could think was, she's old. I did not even know about Mount Meadows Massacre. I didn't know it was 30 miles up the road. I went on my way to Utah State, and I began to learn how to write. Great professors. Went into the military for 12 years in the airborne, and then as a legal investigator. And then I went and got my graduate degrees in English and history at Stephen F. Austin State University under Archie P. McDonald. What a blessing. My job down at Texas Forestry Museum was a research project putting together all the disparate and scattered records on the lumber culture. And as I was going through it, I kept finding these references to the Mormon millers of the Texas Hill Country before the Civil War. So I started taking notes on the side, and then in 1996, when we moved up to Utah again, I put aside the lumber culture and started researching what was Lyman Wight's Texas colony. It was fascinating. The two big things for me that came out of it, one was that the first temple west of the Mississippi for the Mormons was in Zodiac, and that John Pierce Hawley, as a young man, helped to construct it, was married in it, and was an officiator of temple ceremonies.
So to back up, and this led to your first book.
It did.
Right. Yeah. The Polygamy on the Pedernales.
That's
published
right.
by Utah State University Press.
Yeah, with John Alley as my editor. What a blessing.
Right.
Out of this, I developed a real fascination for the character of John Pierce Hawley. Tall, broad-shouldered, strong, slow of speech, absolutely committed from boyhood to the gospel of Joseph Smith. He believed in the Restoration, and from 1837, when he was baptized at the age of 11, to when he died in 1909, 72 years later, he never faltered from the Restoration gospel. Mm-hmm. And as one person said, there's more than one way to Mormon, And John Pierce Hawley walked a lot of those ways.
Right. Before we get too much into the character of John Pierce Hawley, I just want to back up and talk just about you a little bit more and kind of your background. You grew up as a member of the church.
I was christened Anglican in my third week. Family was converted when I was 9, and I had a typical LDS youth background in Southern California. I had the great pleasure, though I didn't know it at the time, of going to seminary with Will Bagley, and he and I are still each other's oldest friends.
Great. That's quite a connection.
It is.
Will Bagley had the great pleasure of attending seminary with Melvin Johnson. Right?
Yeah.
That's great.
Didn't want to boast.
That's great. Now, the first time that I ever heard about John Hawley was when I was writing an article, co-authoring, I should say, with Matthew Groh of the LDS Church History Department on the pineries in Wisconsin Territory that the Latter-day Saints purchased and went up and milled at to get lumber for the Nauvoo House project and the Temple project. And the question was whether or not they were attempting to create a united order system up there, law of consecration system up there, because this would have been after the time that the law of consecration had been declared on hold, I guess you can say. Hiram Smith went around and in 1842 and said, we're pausing this practice. We're going to focus on tithings, right, and surplus of your goods. So John Hawley was a rare treat in that he wrote a few letters back and forth with his brother. I think it was George. Right?
Yes.
Inviting him up there to the lumber mills, and he'd indicated in there that they had taken a full schedule of their properties, indicating that Bishop George Miller was heading up, along with Lyman Wight, a united order. So that was the first mention I had ever heard of John Hawley. His letter ended up becoming the central focus of the article that we published with the Journal of Communal Studies. So I want you to validate my research.
You've got the two names wrong. It was Alan Stout, Hosey Stout's brother, who wrote the letter. But the Hawleys lived at Black River Falls, just down the street in the community.
Right.
Stout did say, yes, we're trying to walk the road of consecration.
Right.
What you had was Lyman Wight, who had been a Campbellite and then a Rigdonite and was committed to a standard of community property dedicated to the entire organization administered by the elders. George Miller, who was a convert in 1839, who had never shown any interest in that type of thing. What an amazing businessman George Miller was. He was tremendous. But when he got to the Wisconsin pineries with Wight, he jumped right on board. Yeah. And in Wisconsin and in Texas, schedules were taken. Everything was dedicated into the community storehouse, and you were given back what you needed to survive. But if you left the colony, you went out empty.
Yeah. No, you're right. It was the Stouts, now that I recall. It wasn't Hawley, but his name certainly floated around that whole experiment that was taking place. And he ended up continuing to follow Lyman after this Wisconsin territory. Give us a little background.
Most of the Wisconsin colony, when they finished their lumber mission in 1844, they were going to float their final timber rafts down to Nauvoo, and they were going to exchange their lumber for the steamship, the Maid of Iowa. Well, that was sold out from under them, and Joseph Smith had given Lyman Wight a mission to go to Texas and open a colony and see if it was a possible stronghold and safe land for moving the church body out of the United States so the Mormons could create their own theocratic kingdom.
Now, you said out of the United States. I think it's important to note that this was at the time that Texas was a separate republic.
No, not yet. Yes, it was.
Yes.
Excuse me.
It had not been annexed yet.
No, it had not. So in late 1844, Lyman Wight dickered with Brigham Young for the continuation of the colony. This was after Joseph Smith and his brother had been murdered, and for the leadership of the Council of 12, the Quorum of 12, to lead the church. And they were going to go somewhere out west.
Right.
And Brigham Young said, Lyman, you can do this. You can take George Miller. You can take Lucian Woodworth, who was known to Joseph as the pagan prophet, and you can take your colony to Texas. By the next spring, when the colony was on the move, Brigham had changed his mind, sent Sam Bent out to tell them to come home.
Yeah.
And Lyman Wight's clerk dismissively wrote a letter back to the 12 saying, we'll talk more and on. Good luck on your journey.
We're fine.
We're fine. It was GTT, gone to Texas.
Right. Now, I want to back up a little bit because I think the Texas history is very interesting when it comes to LDS history in general. Now, I understand, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the initial pitches for going to Texas was an offer to the Texas government that the Mormons would take up the space along the, was it the Rio Grande?
No, that's a common misperception.
Okay.
It would have been farther north, and it would have covered the routes from Mexico into the center of Texas and blocked the Comanche and the Lipan Apache to the west.
Right. Right.
It was the Republic. Joseph, in his Council of 50, with their approval, authorized Lucian Woodworth to go to Texas and negotiate with President Houston.
Right.
Woodworth did in March of 1844, came back within a month and said, President Houston's excited. He wants us to do it, but he has to meet with the Texas Congress in the December of 1844, but he was going to push it. Well, as we know, Joseph and Hiram were murdered in June, and everything went up in the air. Church leadership succession. Do we stay in Nauvoo? Do we move west?
Right.
What do we do? And in all of it, Lyman Wight was saying, I'm taking my colony to Texas. Right. That was the mission Joseph gave me. And the last time that Wight had met with Joseph, Heber C. Kimball was president. Smith blessed him and then gave him a seer stone. Mm. And Lyman Wight held to that mission until his death in 1858. It took him 14 months to march down the borderlands of America to the north bank of the Red River. Yeah. They wintered. Texas became a part of the United States.
Right.
The Mexican-American War began, and the Mormons landed outside of the village of Austin. Mm-hmm. And all of the Texans were terrified of these bloodthirsty Mormons, did not want them there. Noah Smithwick, one of the old Texas settlers, said, let's think this through. We have Buffalo Hump and his Comanche out west. All of these bloodthirsty Mormons are armed to the teeth. Why don't we send them 80 miles west out to partner with the Germans in Fredericksburg and have a barrier? And the crowd gave three huzzas, and Wight and his colony went out to what became Zodiac, 3 miles downriver on the Pedernales. It's pronounced really Pedernales, but if you're a Texan, you say Pedernales. 3 miles from Fredericksburg, and in between the two villages was Fort Martin Scott, a United States Army detachment of about 90 troops. That was a whole American presence on the western Texas frontier.
Yeah. I also understand, backing up before Joseph Smith's assassination, I understand that part of his presidential platform, which included the gradual emancipation of slaves, compensated emancipation of slaves, was that he was a colonist in his slave position, and his idea was to have a settlement in Texas, and then on the other side in Mexico, northern Mexico, that's where the released, emancipated slaves could build their own colony, be a free people in the northern part of Texas.
It was
Mexico,
such a stew of suggestions
Yeah.
on what to do with slavery, where to move the church, and all of that was part of it. Basically, Joseph wanted to create a theocratic kingdom independent of the United States. And he was more than willing to go to Texas with the saints if that was going to fulfill the restoration dream.
Right.
And Lyman Wight was connected to that hip and thigh.
So let's get into John Hawley's connection with Lyman Wight. You had mentioned at the beginning of the interview that they had built the first Mormon temple west of the Mississippi, and that John Hawley was part of this. Tell me a little more.
We'll back up very quickly to Montrose, Iowa, where Father John Smith, the uncle of Joseph Smith, lived. And when they needed more recruits for the sawmills and milling town in Wisconsin, the Hawleys went up to Wisconsin, and there John and his brothers learned logging, timber making, woodworking. They were outstanding loom makers. And they went with the colony to Texas, to Austin, and then to Zodiac, where they built the first temple, up to Mormon Mills. That's in Burnett County, about 50 miles northeast. And in 1853, the Great Schism in the colony occurred. And the Hawley family, minus John and minus Aaron and their families, went up to what is now Oklahoma into the Cherokee Nation. John held on for about a year, and then Lyman Wight was saying, I'm going to take the colony to Mexico. God said we need to go to Mexico. And John Hawley reports in his autobiography that he did not think that was Lyman Wight's role as a prophet to go to Mexico, so he followed his family into the Cherokee Nation.
Gotcha. Talking about the temple that was built in Zodiac. Now, this was above a storehouse, because they were also practicing the United Order there, right? And so they had a bishop storehouse.
It was a community property village, yes.
One of the things that struck me in the writing of your book about the temple practices was that they were more public than how the LDS Church does temple practices. Now, John participated in these. He was sealed, in fact.
Yes.
Right? Tell us a little bit about this and how it seemed to be more of a public event.
Whiteism was far more public as a schismatic sense of Mormonism than the LDS, the Cutlerites, or even the Strangites. John's first wife, Harriet, he married her as two others married their intended spouses out in the prairie near Austin in 1846. And anybody who wanted to watch could come and watch. It was the same thing in 1849 when John married again. It was not polygamy. Harriet had run away with a group of other dissatisfied village members, and Lyman Wight said to John, "You're divorced." So, in that temple, in John's experience, a long garment to the ankles, to the wrist, to the neck, that you only wore the garment during temple ceremonies. It'd be pretty hard to chase Comanche wearing your garments like that. There was no creation drama. There was an anointing, feet washing. The sealing, baptism for the dead. And those were the ordinances in the temple.
They had a font then.
Yes. Yeah. Lyman C. Smith, a Community of Christ historian, way back when, Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as they called it then, said it was just a storehouse. It was far more than that.
Right.
The storehouse was the bottom floor. The second floor was for school, where William Leyland taught the youngsters, but it was also for temple ritual.
Right.
And we have the records, the registars, handwritten by John Young, annotated by John Pierce Hawley. Who did what? Who officiated in this? And who stood proxy?
So, going back to Nauvoo, that's not all that dissimilar from how the red brick store was utilized before the building and the completion of the Nauvoo temple, right? A lot of different training and meetings and the temple ceremonies happening there.
If you're going to say that it was similar to the red brick store's upper floor,
right,
in that it was multi-purpose religiously for meetings, for civic priesthood, and civic, and temple work. Yes.
Yeah.
It was the center place in Zodiac.
You mentioned something about the wearing of the garments, the temple garments, only in connection with doing the temple ceremonies in Lyman Wight's colony. In your opinion, this is something that seems to be debated about by historians. In your opinion, was that also the standard practice in Nauvoo? Or were they wearing their garments much like we do now underneath our clothing day and night?
I don't know.
Yeah.
But I do know that Joseph and Hiram were not wearing their garments at Carthage jail.
He had specifically requested a removal.
Yeah, he did, very much so. And it was the fact that the garments, if you were taken prisoner, would identify you as a Mormon, as a Latter-day Saint.
Of course, everybody would have identified Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith, right?
Yeah, but if you and I had been there, they would check that.
So they were well known enough, it seems, to where that would be an identifying mark.
Yeah. Well, we still hear the comments of magic garments now.
Right.
It has always been an item that has separated the Latter-day Saints from the rest of the world.
I'm just speculating here, but that tells me that they were probably worn outside of just the quiet temple ceremonies if they were publicly known enough to make that an identifying mark of Mormons.
We're talking about the red brick store? Possibly.
Yeah.
And I would think that they probably, some certainly, wore their garments underneath their clothing.
Yeah.
Remember that what was happening at the red brick store, even with the creation drama development, etc., that version, and even less so, Zodiac, were only prototypes for what Brigham Young would introduce in the completed Nauvoo temple, and then in the endowment house, and then St. George when that was built. A friend of mine pointed out the Zodiac temple ceremonies were dumbed down. Wrong term. They were very basic. Sealings, anointings, washings. That takes you back to Kirtland. Sealings takes you back to Nauvoo. But there was no creation drama.
Yeah. They were doing feet washing. Is that right?
Yes, they did.
Which was Kirtland practice.
They did not do the perfuming of bodies. It was the feet, anoint the head. The husbands would ordain their wives as queens and priestesses, and either the patriarch or Apostle Wight would ordain the men as kings in latter-day Israel.
Which that is more akin to the second anointing practice.
Yes, but it was not a second anointing as we understand it now.
It was an initiatory, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, John Hawley would be rebaptized and resealed in Utah in 1856. We can talk about that in a minute.
I'm interested in that.
And then in 1868, John Hawley did receive the second anointing under the hands of Erastus Snow, and then at the strong suggestion of Erastus Snow, assisted Snow in the next group who were receiving their second anointings. Very interesting. Also, John Hawley is the only man, that's wrong, the only individual that we have with a comparison of Zodiac activities and Utah activities and the significant differences between the two.
That makes him a pretty significant figure on its own. The fact that we have somebody who has experienced both styles of either temple worship or just church organization and structure in general, that makes his record very valuable to historical researchers on its own, right?
Oh, it does. John had almost no schooling, but the Hawley clan read and they wrote well. All of them did. And John recreated his life in 1885 from notes that he had kept over 30 years. They were a record-keeping people, and as Mormons, why not?
Yeah.
And his records are very, very valuable. It gives us a window to take a look at Mormonism in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, not only in Texas or in Mormon sanctuary in the Indian nations, but Utah in particular. He was a middle manager, to use terms today. He was that cog in the middle of the machine like so many. Maybe less important than Hosea Stout or Lot Smith, but only a step down. And all of these men and their wives made the machine run and run well.
Mm-hmm. Let's move forward into his journey to Utah, his conversion to, if we're going to use the scholarly vernacular, the Brighamite church, right? So let's talk about what led him there.
Let me note that I use terms like Josephite for the RLDS, Brighamite for the LDS, Cutlerite for Cutler's group.
Alpheus Cutler, right.
Yeah. Not as negative terms, but as terms of identification.
Right. Distinctions.
Yes,
right.
It makes it very easy. Yeah. There's nothing negative about it.
And for listeners who aren't as familiar with the different groups that emerged from Joseph Smith's original church, we've got James Strang, so we call them the Strangites. Right. Like you mentioned, Alpheus Cutler. There's David Whitmer, who for a short time had his following, which we call the Whitmerites, before they pretty much merged into the Reorganization.
Right.
And then there's divisions upon divisions upon divisions. If somebody's interested in this history, I would highly recommend Stephen Shields' epic tome, right? Mm-hmm. And that's Divergent Paths of the Restoration, right? Which, incidentally, we're going to be publishing a 5th edition of. So there's a little plug for the future of that. But that's a great place to get to understand these myriads of hundreds of groups.
Oh, yeah. The 5th edition of Shields is going to be magnificent. A far more basic primer would be Hamer and Bringhurst's Scattering of the Saints. Right. People don't understand that there are almost 800 sectarian groups out of the Restoration.
Right.
Joseph was getting his first taste of that in late 1830.
Sure.
So this was nothing new. Coming back to Hawley.
Yeah.
LDS in Iowa, Missouri, Wisconsin, Whiteites in Texas, free-range Mormons in the Indian nations until our old friend Henry W. Miller from the Red Brick Store leads a mission sent by Brigham into the nations to round up as many of the old Navuers, as they called them, and bring them back to Utah. Now, the Strangites had been down there doing missionary work as well. Several of the families had converted before Miller and his missionaries came. A small second group, of whom Henry B. Eyring's great-grandfather was one, came from St. Louis and missionaried in the nations until 1860. A wagon train immigrant company to Utah led by the Miller Jacob Croft, of which the Hawleys and their kin were a part, 65 members, all reconverted to LDS Mormonism to become Brighamites. And it was based on conferred authority. Who had the priesthood authority to do this? And John Hawley thought, well, Brigham Young does. Now, his father, Pierce Hawley, who had been a patriarch to Wight's church, refused to have anything to do with Brigham Young. He thought he had been cheated. So old Pierce Hawley and his wife remained in the Indian nations. He died there in 1858, and she immigrated to Iowa to join family. In 1856, the Jacob Croft Company immigrates to Utah. They pass the Willie and Martin hen cart companies that would be decimated in the snows. John is the sergeant of the guard, and in his autobiography, he only writes 2 sentences about it. And I have pondered that. I really have. Maybe having been on the frontier so long that this was just normal to him, to be moving under the vault of heavens through Kansas and Nebraska and over the Rocky Mountains. Young Tom Cropper, a 13-year-old cowboy with the Croft Company, was a cow herder and later a first settler in Fillmore. And he wrote diaries and newspaper articles about that trip. And you see what a Mormon wagon train was like. They were fortunate. Nobody died. Nobody got ran over by a wagon. The only Native Americans, First Peoples they saw were at the trading posts. They did not suffer bad weather. They rattled down Immigration Canyon. And for those of you who know Salt Lake, come down 5th South to 4th South, and there at 9th East, turn right, and then turn left at 3rd South, and rumble on down to the wagon yards just north of where the city-county building is now on State Street and 4th South.
Gotcha.
That's where they ended up.
You mentioned rebaptism. Let's get into that now.
Yeah. John and his brother's family, since they were millers, were sent to Ogden, where they bought the Loren Farr sawmill, right downtown there, where the fort was. They were rebaptized. They rededicated their property. Brigham Young rededicated $200,000 worth of his property that year as part of the Mormon Reformation that was going on. And so they were prepared to live out their lives in Weber County, but it didn't work out that way. The next spring, Brigham Young had the idea, I will send all these Texans and Southerners that have come in the last year down to Washington County, to Washington, a brand new community. It was called Adair Springs then. And they're going to grow cotton. And George and John's families were part of that with Covingtons, Adairs, and others. And so in the spring, the 2 brothers dropped their wives off in Spanish Fork with the Keltine family. The Keltine wife was the women's sisters. They had married sisters. And on down to Washington they went. John D. Lee was there. Robert Covington was there. Harrison Pierce was there. And this was a rough group of people. Yeah. If you're going to send people down into the frontier, and this was to help re-strengthen the Santa Clara mission just upriver. it was a good route to send. That planting season in Washington was awful. They lost the cotton crop, lost most of the potatoes and corn, and the Hawleys look up to the north and they see that beautiful Pine Valley mountain. And they know there's a valley up there that Isaac Riddle had discovered that same summer. At the end of the planting year, they go up and pick their wives up in Spanish Fork, go up to, it would have been George Albert Smith's house, where they would have been resealed and married for time and eternity, and then come back down south, and just after Corn Creek, they catch up with the Fancher Baker immigrant train.
Before we get into the Fancher Baker immigrant train, because this is an important part of the story, I want to back up for listeners who maybe not be as familiar with why people were being rebaptized, resealed. I think you alluded to it in
Mormon Reformation.
In the Mormon Reformation. Also, it seems that there was a lack of accepting Lyman Wight's authority as far as sealing authority and things like that, right? But this Mormon Reformation, I just want to just briefly define this for people and why people were being rebaptized, and then we'll move forward into the...
Sure. It begins with Jedediah Grant, second counselor to Brigham Young, and he was called Brigham's Hammer. It was to re-energize, re-spiritualize the Mormon people. Remember, they've had a decade of non-Mormons coming through Salt Lake City from the California gold fields and back and forth. And maybe the commitment, the leadership thought, to a Mormon theocratic nation at the top of the mountains was waning. Well, they were into their second generation. It would be a different culture and outlook. So the idea of the Mormon Reformation was a catechism of certain questions that the bishops and their helpers would visit every family, whether in Salt Lake or in a village, and go through the questions. Do you believe in Joseph's mission? To secular things, do you keep a clean house? Do you keep your irrigation ditches clean? Do you keep your body clean? And you get to sense a spiritual cleanliness.
Yeah. Now, you actually listed these questions out.
Yeah, I did.
Do you think that this was a backdrop for what's become the current practice of a temple recommend interview?
I'd never considered that before, but it'd certainly be something to look at, that you were going to, professionalize is not the right word.
I like the catechism aspect seems to work.
Yeah. Well, the bishop and the member of the stake president go through a catechism, and Mormons do that with tithing settlement at the end of the year. There's a list of questions you go through.
Right.
Institutionalization
there you go.
Of the process. And what you're really doing, if we're following that thought, is that we're taking a frontier and a borderland people who have been out in the middle of nowhere for 10 years, and the Quorum of the 12 and the leadership are reforming the body, the old barrel and the hoops around the barrel, and then tightening the hoops on the barrel so it becomes a coherent community with common principles and goals and acceptance of the way things are.
Not to get into a tangent off this too much, but it reminds me of, if you look at the history of Christianity in general, Orthodoxy really began to emerge in the early medieval period, right? And it was, before that, Christianity was really a scattered concept that had a myriad of different expressions in different churches and throughout Eastern Europe and the Near East and whatnot. But it was really the Roman Church in the 4th century that began an orthodoxy campaign to try to create a coherency of belief and commitment. I see a similar thing happening here.
I agree with it. The Stephen Farnsworth barrel and hoop vision that he had in 1844, that he saw the saints way out in the west under the leadership of the 12. Joseph and Hiram were not with them, and all the saints had been poured into this barrel, and the barrel was being tightened with the hammers, and dissident saints were spurting out and running across the prairie away. And I think you're right that you're seeing a formation of a Brighamite orthodoxy.
Right.
And you certainly see that followed with John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, Joseph F. Smith, and on forward.
Right. Right.
A coherent sense of what it is to be a Utah Mormon.
Right. And I think that that is something that's important to understand because it has vast implications for the identity, the cultural identity of adherents to the faith today. Right.
I agree with that. As one of our friends says, there's more than one way to Mormon. But for Rocky Mountain Mormons and those who associate with them, there is a particular orthodoxy that is expected.
Yeah.
And is lived. And I agree with your understanding that the Reformation was part of that formation.
Right, right. So let's move forward, jumping a little bit ahead here. He learns of the Josephites. Again, that's the reorganization that's taking place in the Midwest. 1860 is when they really became a formal group, right? And Joseph Smith III, Joseph Smith's eldest son, was installed as the first prophet president of the Reorganization Church. Emma Smith also joined along with, and they began sending missionaries out not too long after that to try to reclaim what they felt was some of the their brothers and sisters that had gone on to Utah and followed Brigham Young. To try to reclaim them, particularly those who were adverse to polygamy, which was taking place, in the territory. As a caveat, I spent a summer in Nauvoo as a tour guide, and one of the jokes that I would often make about the reorganized church, a light joke, and any of our listeners that are members of the community of Christ, I think you'll appreciate this, is I would say a lot of people aren't familiar with the original full title of the church's name, which was the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we are not the polygamous Mormons from Utah. Right? That was on everybody's business card. Right? They always had to differentiate themselves as being part of the restoration that Joseph Smith began, but not those polygamists that were in Utah. Right?
Lyman Wight did the same thing down in Texas, took it out in the New York sun. Said, come to Texas, sunny clime, wonderful weather. Well, obviously he was counting on people having never been in Texas in either the summer or the winter. And he says, we do not follow the Brighamite Church of Utah.
Despite the fact that he actually was practicing polygamy.
Oh, he denied they were.
Right.
But yes, the colony was polygamous to the bone.
Right. I think so they started sending missionaries out, right? Particularly for those who were feeling disaffected from Brigham Young's teachings or from the practice of polygamy, and attracting them back to the Midwest, right? We had people who were leaving the Midwest. So when did John Hawley first learn of these missionary efforts? I don't need an exact date, but it was down in the southern
I'm thinking
Pine
about
Valley. Right?
John Hawley was, back it up just for a moment. The Hawleys come back with the Fancher Baker train. They get through the Mountain Meadow Massacre. Two of John's brothers were on the killing field.
Yeah.
John denied that he was, nearly lost his life. Harrison Pierce, a counselor to Bishop Covington, wanted him killed, secret priesthood meeting, narrow vote. John gets to live. Uncle Billy Young comes to John privately and says, tone it down. John says, murder is murder, and I will not be quiet. However, with Mormonism, there's always a however, is there not? There were only 2 Mormon militia members that owned 6-shooters, revolvers, that are listed on the records. One was Ira Hatch, the Indian missionary from Santa Clara. The other was John Hawley. And quite a number of the dead had bullet wounds created by pistol balls. So, John may have been lying. I don't think he was. The alternate explanation would have been one of his brothers borrowed his revolver.
Right.
Moving forward.
Just real quick, I'm glad that you went back to that because I had skipped over it. And that was a really significant thing. We had brought up the Fancher Baker train, and then I just moved quite a bit ahead of that. For listeners who are trying to follow along, so John Hawley, he was immediately aware that the massacre had happened.
He was aware,
and that was something that was publicly aware, right? I mean, this is publicly known. It was reported on fairly quickly. Now, in your book, you talk about that he went back to his congregation. He condemned it.
Indeed, powerfully.
Right.
Stood up and condemned it and said, murder will out. And there were murderers, and I have no hesitation to use that term. There were murderers sitting in that congregation.
Who had participated in the massacre.
Yes.
Yeah.
There were massacre. Yeah.
So his public condemnation of them led to the question of what do we do with this guy?
Well, they voted to whether they were going to put him out of the way, send him across lots, and
which was a euphemism for
killing him.
Killing him, yeah.
And the vote was very close. Now remember, these are Texans and Southerners. They all have a common way of life, along with all of them being Latter-day Saints for many, many, many years. So they're talking about whether we're going to kill somebody that we've known and associated with for a long time. You talk about a conformity, about an orthodoxy. And there is a certain orthodoxy in the organization by 1857 that some obviously thought would extend to murdering whom they considered to be the enemy. John survives, and I never realized that before, but that is probably one of the reasons the Hawley families and their kin and friends took their homesteads from Washington and moved up to Pine Valley, 30 miles away.
Right.
I would not want to be John Hawley and living on the next lot to John D. Lee or have Harrison Pierce on the other side.
Right.
He goes up to Pine Valley. It is a lumber community. It is to supply lumber for Eastern Nevada, Dixie in the area, and they do a good job. Hawley is the presiding elder. He has come into the full manhood of his Mormonism and his priesthood duties. And he is not a lackadaisical guy. People got to toe the line if you're going to live in Pine Valley. He becomes aware of the Josephites, and this is a good place to segue back to that. Some of his friends from the Indian nations in Texas, the Malloys, the Dugans, Taylor, Young, who married his sister, have become first converts in the Reorganization, the Josephite missionaries that come out in 1863 and 1864. They are writing letters down to Pine Valley telling Joseph this really is the right road to walk to Mormonism. John notes that the Quorum of the 12 and the leadership under President Young condemns the reorganized church soundly, the worst apostates that there could be. So he's been aware of them for 3 or 4 years. before he will be called on a mission to Western Iowa to go reconvert family and brethren from the RLDS to Utah Mormonism and bring them west.
So the missionary efforts were going both ways.
And that's what I wanted to follow up. Thank Todd Compton, thank Paul Reeve, that we have this idea of these wild men in the canyons and the Red Rock country, that they're out in the middle of nowhere. It's not the truth. Think about it. Panguitch to Santa Clara is no more than a 2-day ride. It's a 1-day ride from St. George to Cedar City. From Cedar City and Parowan north, you're into Nephi within 10 to 12 days. You're into Salt Lake a week later, and you have the telegraph down to St. George by 1868. The distances are long, but the technology, as it always does, conflates time and space.
Right.
So we have this fluidity, whether it's Wight, whether it's First Peoples moving about. Information is disseminated very, very quickly.
Particularly with the publishing, that newspaper publishing,
Yes.
and then eventually the railroad. Right.
Yeah. So while they might be a wild, rude people in the outback country, they are still, as Compton, Reeve, and others point out, very well aware of what's going on. Now, take it a step further. It's also the same way with the various sects of Joseph's restoration. Strangite, Cutlerite, Reorganized, Josephite, Brighamite, whatever other ite is out there, are moving back and forth between the sects. People know what are going on with their friends and families 1,000 miles away, and more than that, they want to know. They want to know what Aunt Jane or Cousin William or the family are up to. We are a species that does not do well by ourselves alone. That's why in our modern day and age, we keep misusing the term family for baseball teams or the PTA. We're a family. But it's the concept that we harmonize as groups, and that there's something in our basic nature that needs us. And it's one of the reasons why Mormonism does so well. It harmonizes the whole.
Right. Right. So he goes out to Iowa. He's preaching conversion to the Brighamite church, to his stray Josephite relatives.
And friends.
And friends. They're preaching back to him, conversion to the Josephite church from the strayed Brighamite branch. They don't seem to get anywhere with each other at the moment.
No, they don't. But we get to see insights from a Brighamite into RLDS leaders like Mark Forscoot or Charles Derry or Old Father Roundy, who are just names in history to us, but we see them come alive as John talks to them. We see a side of Joseph Smith III and his brothers when John realizes they're not making a lot of money. They're poor.
Yeah.
They're living day by day. Yeah. And it's the sense of connection.
Right.
So he goes back to Utah. Now think about it. Sealed twice, anointed twice, second anointing LDS, presiding elder for 11 years, and then when the first bishopric is organized in Pine Valley, first counselor. The only reason he is not the bishop, and all you William Snow descendants, forgive me, is that William was, and a good Mormon, and a brother to Erastus Snow. He was a polygamist, and Erastus Snow did not believe that monogamous should achieve high priesthood positions. Samuel Knight, the great Indian interpreter in St. George, was a monogamous, Lydian Knight's stepson. and would not join the High Council in St. George Stake until the year after Erastus Snow's death. Both Knight and Hawley show an insight into that concept of polygamy, superior church position, and service. Yes, you'll get to exaltation, but you won't have as much as the man with 4 wives.
Right. That I think we can cut in with this right here. Hawley's relationship with polygamy. This was a stumbling block for him.
Hawley will backtrack and his testimony and then put it into the context of evidence. He backtracks back and forth on polygamy.
And you're talking about the Temple Lot case, right? Which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, but the fact is, in my humble opinion of what I know about John Hawley, he knew about polygamy probably early as 1844. He never mentions that his oldest sister was Lyman Wight's 4th wife. He never mentions his brother George had 3 wives at the same time. He never mentions that he married George's 3rd wife, who had been divorced from George, to Joseph Hawley's ward, Joseph Hadfield. He lived in a polygamous community. He had, in Wisconsin, on the trail to the Republic of Texas, at Zodiac, in the Indian Territory where George, his brother, had his wives, in Utah Territory, and John would not change his story that it began with Joseph until the Temple Lot case in 1892. Mm-hmm. And it bothered him. He wasn't the only elder that it bothered. It bothered Samuel Knight. It bothered a lot of the early Mormon priesthood holders. But he decided finally, after talking with Brigham Young and Erastus Snow, that he should really do this if he was going to be a Brighamite Mormon. And so he connected a proposed marriage with a daughter of James Emmett, the great Mormon frontiersman. It had been James Emmett who baptized his parents. And the old Hawley family story folklore, Emily Emmett lived right up in Pinto, about 14 miles from Pine Valley. You had to go through Grass Valley, cross Little Pinto Creek and into Pinto, and John was going to pick her up and drive her up to Salt Lake. They were going to do it right. Well, he gets the wagon down in Little Pinto Creek, and the axle falls off. And John, supposedly, according to my friend Robert Hawley, who's no longer with us, I miss him, takes it as a sign from Providence that he should not marry polygamously. Emily, according to John, went along with it well. And John fixes his wagon, goes on to Salt Lake City, and sends news to an elated Sylvia back home that she's not going to have a sister wife join them.
It's a fun story.
It's a fun story.
Yeah.
Some of the other things aren't. He doesn't like the economic unity of shopping Mormon at the exclusion of better deals elsewhere. He buys a Walker Brothers wagon, superior product for the day, $45 cheaper than with a church merchant. He gets chewed out, but not disciplined. Remember, he's the first counselor in a bishopric out on the frontier. But as he rolls back down to Utah, he's thinking about Adam God, about polygamy, but probably more importantly about authority, whether conferred authority through priesthood or patriarchal authority through blood. Lyman Wight believed in Joseph Smith Jr.'s sons, succeeding him as president prophet. And now whether John is trying to find reasons to make up his mind for a decision that he's already made. And remember, he saw his mother for the first time in 12 years on the mission. Held his mother for the first time in 12 years and had her. My mother is gone. I would love to have my mother hold me again, and I'm 70 years old. His family is there. Yeah. Some of Sylvia's family is there. And he gets back and he's talking with his brother George, and a couple of elders out at Hamlin come visiting by because one of the RLDS elders of the new missions that have come out, and the senior RLDS elder's father, who lived out at Hamlin, threw him out of the house, wouldn't let him talk about the reorganization, came by way of the Hawleys, and all the Hawleys sat down to listen with big ears, and then went on their way. Erastus Snow heard about it, came up and said, "What are you doing? They're apostates." Joseph promised that I will not contact them, but if they come by, I will talk to them. And then he begins a season of serious introspection. Yeah. Finally comes to the conclusion that he and his family are going to join the reorganization. George Hawley and his family sign on. So John Hawley writes a letter to Joseph Smith III in Iowa. It's printed in the Saints Herald, their newspaper, saying that John Hawley and his kin in Pine Valley, Utah, announce their allegiance to the true church. And Joseph Brand, who Hawley says is probably crazier than a loon, but an RLDS elder, reads it and comes out to Grass Valley to interview the Hawleys. And John said, crazy or not, he was convinced that John Brand held the authority, notice that, held the authority to baptize them. And they were baptized.
Once again baptized.
Yeah, for the seventh time. Once again baptized. In the Hawleys. And the first counselor then, John Hawley, preaches his final sermon to Pine Valley Ward to a very startled congregation. You find no record in other diaries or journals other than Wanda Snow Peterson writing, in the biography of William Snow, her grandfather, that John Hawley, the first counselor, had apostatized.
Right. I want to circle back to something that we kind of just glanced over, and that's the question of authority being given by ordination versus authority by lineal authority, familial authority, right? Because it seems to me clear when I look at the historical record that the question of the significance of Joseph Smith's boys and their leadership potential or destiny within the church was something that was uncontested, even from the Utah saints. Even Brigham Young had in his mind that had Emma not corrupted them in his mind, right, that they would have eventually assumed leadership role in the church, that this was their destiny, that it seemed that they did respect this idea of a familial lineage as far as and you even see that with Brigham Young with his own sons.
Yes.
Right? Brigham Young Jr., John Willard Young, that they're being ordained as apostles and being installed into high leadership
at the ages of 8 and 11.
Right. But this concept of bloodline is not that foreign to early Utah Mormons in the other groups.
I don't think it's foreign at all to any of them. A developing theme, and it's taken 100 years and more to develop, is the concept of a royal Abrahamic priesthood. that is conferred literally by lineage and by blood. In the patriarchal blessings, you are told from which lineage you came. And if you're not from literally the bloodline of whatever tribe that you come from.
Ephraimites, for instance.
Either transformationally or biologically, your blood becomes part of that lineage. Well, if you're believing in membership, I like the term harmonize, using the blood image to harmonize with your community. Also, your leadership harmonizes. Joseph F. Smith, in his diaries as a teenager out in the Hawaiian Islands, there's no question that he believes that he's in a royal lineage,
right,
in the priesthood.
Right.
Well, if Joseph F. is, so is his cousins, the sons of Joseph Smith. Brigham Young and you as a member are part of this royal priesthood, and within the priesthood there are family lineages destined to leadership. That's the concept. Well then, if Joseph's sons had come to Utah, they would be recognized of having the authority to become president, prophet, and also patriarch to the entire church. Now, how Brigham Young was thinking how that would work, possibly with himself as a regent behind the throne to the Smith boys, I don't know. But yeah, he recognized it. He said Joseph Smith III had forfeited it because of his wicked ways, but that he thought Alexander Hale and David Hiram would certainly come to the forefront. Well, history tells us that did not happen.
Right.
So this is what John Hawley is struggling with: patriarchal family priesthood leadership, conferred authority. He comes with, though he doesn't call it, royal Abrahamic priesthood by blood lineage.
Right.
As long as there is a Smith descendant alive and he's worthy. Now, how much did John actually believe all that in the beginning? Well, how much does anyone believe where they are at in their spiritual journey at any given time in that journey? It is always a mixture in differing proportions.
Right.
Some of it may have been John was convincing himself of what he wanted to do. But also, I think some of it, he knew that for him, Adam God was stupid theology. It just made no sense to him.
Couldn't reconcile it.
He couldn't reconcile polygamy. He was very unhappy with community property or the church telling him how to handle his private economic and monetary affairs. If you're using that, going back to that Farnsworth standard of the barrel and the hoops, and it's being tightened, John is being squeezed out. And he's not unhappy about it. So, in November of 1870, the Hawley families climb on board the train. And for the first time in 5 or 6 trips across the interior of America, he rides the train the whole way. This is a man who was born in 1826, when you could move no faster than a sailing ship or a horse-drawn transport, or your feet could take you before the telegraph. But by the time he died, there was manned flight and telephone and steamships. In 1876, when he is 50, America is still transforming. Philadelphia Exposition, Custer's Last Stand, and the organization of the National Baseball League. The world that he was born into in 1826 transformed itself beyond imagination to when he died in 1909. And so had Mormonism from 1830 to 1870, and then for almost another 40 years. Dale Morgan says it's right when that you're talking about Mormonism, you are not talking about immutability. Everything continues to change as you're a Mormon. And you're seeing it in the LDS church now. 2-hour block meetings. But when I was a boy, we had meetings all week long. And when the 2-hour block meetings came into effect, all of the Johnson family got up on their happy feet. Or missionaries now, just last week, being able to use social media to contact home. I'm sure they've been doing it anyway. But if you're going to send out 18-year-olds, then make it worth their while. If they're going to go on missions, that they can harmonize with home. John Hawley is dealing with all those same issues, but with a different technology, a different sense of civilization, and a different culture. But I like what we've come up with today. Yeah. John is trying to find a harmonious union with what he understands what the restoration is. And as a Mormon Ulysses wandering across the American West, he is trying to find his way to a harmonious home.
It sounds like a fantastic place to end this, but I'm not going to end it because I have a couple of more questions and then we'll end it.
Okay, we'll call this the postscript.
The postscript, right. This is the epilogue. Right. In fact, this actually does make a great epilogue because it is an appendix in your book. Let's talk briefly about the Temple Lot case and what the circumstances were behind the Temple Lot case for listeners who are unaware of it, and John Hawley's testimony.
You bet. Case. It's a legal fight on who owns the temple plot in Independence. The church lot, and I do not remember its official name, a very small group, very wise, came into Jackson County in Independence again in the 1860s. A quick aside, one of the fun things about Lyman Wight taking his wagon train supposedly back to the Midwest in 1858, they didn't get there, he died on the second day of the trip, was that people kept saying Lyman Wight was going to take his wagon train back to Jackson County. Really? The old settlers would have killed him if he had come back to Jackson County. Where he was headed for, obviously, was Iowa.
Right.
And one of the fun things would have been Lyman Wight explaining to Joseph Smith III, yeah, your daddy was the fount and founder of polygamy. I would have loved to have known how Joseph III would have handled that.
Right.
But going back to independence, by the 1860s, Mormons in small numbers and inoffensive ways were allowed back into the county. This one small group, the church lot, bought the lot on which the temple would be built. Many years later, the reorganized LDS challenged that, and they won it. They won the case. And then the church lot appealed, and then it went up the appellate ladder. The RLDS attorneys were handling most the sworn depositions and testimonies in support of one side or the other. And both sides were really playing unfair as they could. John Hawley was brought in as a witness on where polygamy began.
Why was that important to the case?
It wasn't. What it was important to was the RLDS, who wanted to get it on record that Joseph Smith Jr. was not the founder of polygamy. It was Brigham Young.
Thereby showing that they are really the continuation of Joseph Smith's.
And that they are Joseph Smith Jr.'s legitimate organization. And this is where John Hawley. And understand that John Hawley is a man of his time. He doesn't write much about women. He is a certain white male patriarchal pioneer of that kind. He writes dismissively of First Peoples, though he had been quite familiar with them as a baby and into his youth. There had been Native Americans in and out of the Hawley households forever. He never talks about African Americans. He doesn't even note that he and George signed some slave sales in Indian Territory so that Jacob Croft could get some money together for the wagon train across. John was a typical white, lower middle class agricultural male of his time. He was patriarchal. He was racialist. He was very firm in his religion. He was not different than anybody else in his group. And that didn't matter whether you were RLDS for the most part, and certainly LDS on the large part. He's brought in as a stolid man, stalwart in the faith. And he had been an RLDS member now for 22 years, but he had gone back a previous 33 through the various denominations. There was probably no man alive who was more authorized to talk about all of these things than John Hawley, because he had seen them, lived them, and knew the personalities. He lied. He said the first time that he had heard of polygamy and endowments and all of that was with the Lyman Wight colony. I don't believe that, because in his autobiography, he writes that Joseph Smith had gone into bad ways, and that if Joseph, even though a true prophet, was living by the fleshy arm, that put that aside. Adam God, put that aside. Polygamy, put that aside and go with what you have. So he exonerated Joseph. Joseph was pure.
But there was a motive.
Oh, yeah. And it was to show that the RLDS church was the true church. He doesn't talk about that he knew Fanny Alger's father. And her father talked about Joseph and Fanny to John. He doesn't talk about William Marks telling, even though an old man in 1868, the former stake president, saying, Joseph came to me and said, we've got to put this polygamy thing away. And where I've erred, but we've got to get rid of it, or it will be the end of the church and probably my death. John doesn't talk about his brother having 3 wives. John doesn't talk about his sister being a plural wife to Lyman Wight. John was flesh and blood in the Mormon community in all of the communities for 55 years before his testimony. He got up there to argue that the RLDS church, the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, without a hyphen, was the true legitimate succession to the Church of Joseph Smith Jr.
Right. I think we're going to wrap it up there.
All right.
There's a comment that we got from an early review that I wanted to share because I think it indicates your approach to writing biography and history in general. The comment came in that the book felt as much like a narrative history or a monograph as it does a biography, right? And I take that as a compliment because I think, when we get bogged down into psychoanalysis of character, sometimes we lose cultural context. And I think that your job has been very well served in providing historical, cultural context that allows the reader to understand not just John Hawley, but the environment from which he sprang up in, the experiences that he had, what they teach us about the history of Mormonism. And I have to imagine that some of this came through your training, both as a historian and an English writer.
It does. I had one of the great advantages of my generation to being a grad student of Dr. Archie P. McDonald, the biographer of the map maker to Robert E. Lee in the Valley. And Archie taught me the land makes the man. The religion, or lack of it, makes the man. His neighbors make the man. And his life and times make the man. I know the person who made the comment about biography and narrative history, dear friend of mine and a great historian. And I agree with you. I take it as a compliment because we learn about John Hawley in his milieu. We see the barrel and hoop pressures that form him, but also through the eyes of John Hawley, we have this unique view of whom I consider probably the most unique people of European civilization. I'm not talking native civilization, that's a whole different thing. But of European civilization in North America, the most unique culture, Mormonism, since those of the Pilgrims and the Puritans. They are tremendous bookends between the 17th and the 19th centuries of what it means in a great deal to be an American.
I appreciate your time, Mel.
Thank you.
So to our viewers and listeners, we want to thank you for joining us. We hope that you've enjoyed this conversation that we've had. We hope that you've been able to gain some insights into Latter-day Saint history and the importance of John Pierce Hawley as one individual that reflects multiple strains of the Mormon tradition. Again, the book is titled Life and Times of John Pierce Hawley, Mormon Ulysses in the American West. And if you want to learn more about this book, then please visit us at gregcoford.com. Thank you for listening.